Hey everyone, so I was recently watching a podcast between Joe Rogan and Dave Rubin, and the topic of regulation came up. They both agreed on quite a bit pertaining to the overregulation of the United States, and then the issue of regulation concerning construction came up. And Joe Rogan, despite the fact that I love his podcast and I agree with him in a good amount of the time, he would not concede that construction regulations are at least a bit out of hand, and for good reason, because Dave Rubin, who I also really like, did not do the best job of persuading Rogan in this matter, in my opinion anyway. First and foremost, let me say a little personal story without going into too many details because most of it's actually pretty boring. But there's a business that I'm not a part of, but I know many people involved in. They built a building with more than 250 doors in it. Each door had a width of 36 inches. After construction was completed, a government inspector came in and said all the doorways, thresholds, and walls perpendicular to the doors had to be redone because the width of the doors needed to be 37 inches. This was gone over by state inspectors beforehand, and it had been given the green light. Then after all was said and done, they said instead of 36-inch wide doors, they needed to be 37 inches wide. Almost $500,000 later, and I'm not kidding, they were good to go. This is the insanity of regulations that we're talking about here. If you want to keep regulations on the books that only concern nightmare scenarios that Joe Rogan was talking about, fine. That is low on my list of priorities. Have a law that you can't make a skyscraper out of particle board if you want. But the point is that would never happen anyway because of reputation. It's something I've said before. I favor reputation over regulation. Anyone linked to a particle board skyscraper would be done for in that industry. I know that that's an absurd premise, of course, but we so often hear absurd premises coming from the pro-regulation side, I think I'm entitled to use a little absurdity to state my case. But anyway, I sincerely want to address Joe Rogan's concerns here a bit. I want to point out a private company called Underwriter Laboratories. There are plenty of companies like Underwriter Laboratories, but I'll just talk about them for now. They are a company that takes products and puts them through a gauntlet of tests and safety assessments. In fact, almost every electrical and mechanical product sold in the US undergoes these tests from Underwriter Laboratories, or at least one of the other companies in this industry. This is not government mandated. Companies that might even be run by an evil, greedy CEO that would cut corners want their products to be tested in this way because they know, especially in today's day and age, the moment you sell a toaster that explodes, for example, you can kiss your entire reputation and your career and your income goodbye. So this all happens within and around the realm of the private sector. So this notion that the government is absolutely necessary to prevent a state of chaos does not reflect reality all that well. And here's another point. Shoddy construction still happens with the regulation we have. Injuries and deaths still occur because of bad craftsmanship. And I think that the glorification we give the government has a lot to do with it. People way too comfortably breathe a sigh of relief when the government gets involved because they falsely believe that they're going to keep the monsters at bay. But let me give you a prime example of when that did not happen. Bernie Madoff. I'm sure we all know the story. Madoff promises a bunch of junk investments to investors and claims they'll see great returns. For a long while, he keeps concocting phony numbers and he makes it seem like it's all on the up and up. But it was not. And a few private firms, and specifically one private citizen named Harry Markopolos, called him out on the phony numbers years before the SEC ever even knew they might want to do something about it. In fact, this private citizen warned the SEC over and over, and yet they did absolutely nothing. According to Markopolos, he said it took him about 5 minutes to go over Bernie Madoff's marketing materials and about 4 hours to develop mathematical models to prove that Madoff was a scam. Yet the SEC fell a mile short for years. Yet people still have this completely undeserved trust in government and the SEC. Yet what happens to the SEC after they make such a huge mistake? Well, budgets are increased to make sure it doesn't happen again. Whereas in the private sector, you would have failed. Good try, but out with you. It would be time for a better organization to come in and more effectively protect investors or consumers. So it's time to dispel the myth that the government is a cure-all and that the private sector would be dead in the water in dealing with these terrible circumstances. The private sector has very effective ways in dealing with these issues, and frankly, Joe Rogan has to do better than just saying he knew a few sleazy construction workers that would cut corners, and without government they would somehow run amok. And anyway, this is actually my final point now. Accountability. Joe Rogan and Dave Rubin actually kind of agreed on this from what I remember, but accountability is a huge issue with the government. Who lost their job at the SEC after the Madoff scandal? The answer is nobody. Some 8 people or so were disciplined, but no one was fired. We are talking about years of incompetence, which ended in thousands of people being completely financially ruined. And no one loses their job. Do you think that if an employee at Underwriter Laboratories gave the green light to an exploding toaster, that they would be showing up to work next Monday? I sincerely doubt it, because Underwriter Laboratories knows that they would soon cease to exist if they allowed people like that working for them. The government does not seem to have this same fail-safe. Joe Rogan defends the government in this case, and considering he has a history in construction and government inspections are all he knows, I can kind of see why, honestly. But he needs to rethink his position on the private sector, which is vastly superior in terms of holding people accountable and thus keeping people safer. Now, I am not saying that the private sector is a panacea. It is not a cure-all. Bad things will occur under private systems, but I think the evidence is overwhelming that these types of issues are far better handled in the flexible and responsive hand of the free market rather than the incompetent hands of the government, where failures are too often met not with firings and downsizing, but with bigger budgets. Thanks, and that's all.